Really grateful for all of you to be here. Thanks to UMOCA for having me as an artist-in-residence, and the staff for being so supportive. I'm going to show you guys a lot of pictures tonight because I take a lot of pictures, but I don't show them that often. They mostly sit on my hard drive, so I'm going to air some out. This project started in around 2016, 2017. I was living in Chicago. I had moved there for grad school in 2016 and kind of was surprised at how suburban Chicago felt. I grew up in New York and kind of spent my time between New York City and upstate New York, and didn't really spend a lot of time in the suburbs. We would drive through them in between the country and the city, but they really, for me, for a long time felt like a place to drive through. And I, maybe stop for cheap gas in New Jersey or something. But my first experience kind of living for real in the suburbs, I moved to Tempe, Arizona in 2011, I think, maybe 2012. But Phoenix, Arizona, Tempe's kind of a small city outside of Phoenix, but it's all very suburban, even though it's one of the bigger cities in America. And something I've come to realize is that most of the cities in America are actually mostly suburbs. They have a downtown a lot of the time, but mostly people live in the suburbs and live a suburban lifestyle, driving around. And so when I moved to Chicago, I kind of switched back into suburb mode. I had a car that used to be my grandmother's that I drove around everywhere, which I loved very much. And it would take me kind of all over the place. I was both sourcing materials for art projects that I was working on in grad school, but also just looking around and trying to get more familiar with the city. Chicago is a historically kind of very racially segregated town, and there are a number of reasons for that, but one of them is redlining, which is the practice of not renting or selling houses to black folks to keep the property values high, because there's this idea that white neighborhoods are worth more. So this is a map from one of those kind of redlining projects that were going on. So you wind up with a lot of places in Chicago that look like this, and then a lot of places in Chicago that look like this. And I was really interested in that discrepancy. And really, if you turn off a main street in Chicago, in most parts, you wind up in these kind of very suburban feeling neighborhoods. And I was wondering about the lifestyle there and why these people were living so close to this city, but not in it. And around that same time there had been the 2016 presidential election, and the environment was very kind of politically charged. And also there was this funny thing where all the cities went blue and all the rural areas went red, but then the suburbs were kind of in the middle, and they became this like political battleground, and that I think fueled my interest in that space as this kind of in-between middle space in the country, both like ideologically and politically too. So for a long time I was thinking that my kind of working title for this project has been the middle this whole time. And there was also a lot of stuff going on in the news around that time about self-defense and like castle doctrine and stand your ground laws, and lots of self-defense shootings and no-knock warrant raids, and like Breonna Taylor was a kind of tragic poster child for the failure of no-knock warrants, which is the police practice of instead of knocking on your door and serving you a warrant during normal hours, they get all their guns and stuff and bust your door down at 2 o'clock in the morning, which obviously is a terrible idea, especially in a country where so many people own guns. And there are laws that tell you if somebody breaks into your house, you have the legal right to kill them in most places in this country. So all of that stuff was also kind of bouncing around in my head while I was looking at these houses, and they started to seem very kind of like tucked away and hidden, and like they were kind of hiding from the world. And there's a lot of rhetoric too in Chicago about Chicago being a very dangerous city, which it definitely is in certain places for certain people, but by and large there's like huge swaths of Chicago where just normal people live and work and don't deal with the stuff you hear about in the news a lot. But I think it kind of affects the psychology of these places that feel like they need to be kind of hiding away. And it brought me back to that idea of like white flight that happened in a lot of these cities in kind of the middle of the 20th century, where a lot of white families were moving out of cities into the suburbs, also because of things like the GI Bill. But yeah, this feeling of these houses kind of hiding from the world really stuck with me. They either seemed fearful or vigilant and watchful. So there are the hiding houses, and then there started to be these kind of like guard dog houses too that I would see. And the whole time I'm just photographing them and thinking about the relationship between like a house and its surroundings and what is communicated by a home just from how it looks and what kind of message it's broadcasting outward, just from simple things like the decision to put a window there. But a lot of them really communicated this kind of closed offness to me, like these places were kind of turning away from the outside and really focusing inward and separating themselves from public space and really kind of declaring the private world for themselves. And I started paying attention to the lines between public and private space, and how a lot of the time the outside space of a suburb or a subdivision or a neighborhood felt very kind of abandoned and almost given up on, and it almost felt like these empty, neglected spaces needed to exist in contrast to the more put together spaces. So I just kept photographing from the outside of these places to kind of try to embody that feeling of exclusion that was being produced by the inside spaces. So on the inside of the neighborhood, maybe you're okay, or maybe not. And I think the design and the urban planning kind of started to make this hierarchy of who belongs and who doesn't based on that. So around that time I made this piece, which is called Exclusion Exercise, and I installed it in an apartment gallery in Chicago, which is a big thing there. People run little galleries out of their apartments. And I put this vinyl siding barrier in a closet. So I like the idea that siding is such an external material, but I was putting it inside. So even though you're inside an apartment, inside somebody's house, you're being kind of placed on the outside of something. And so as you get closer, you can kind of look through these holes and you get this image, which you're still on the outside, you're even further away. And so that idea of like, there always being more kind of barriers to entry was big for me here. So I kept taking pictures around the burbs of these kind of like hiding, scared houses or fortified houses that felt like they were ready for some kind of catastrophic thing to happen. Or like very watchful ones that felt like almost vigilantes of the neighborhood. And at the same time, I was in grad school and I was reading a lot of theory and learning a lot, and this idea of the panopticon became a really big idea for me, which in kind of contemporary culture is very familiar to us. The idea of the panopticon is a prison design with a central guard tower that you can't see into, and all of the cells are arranged around the guard tower. So you never know if you're being watched or not. And it affected the prisoner's behavior because since they didn't know if they were being watched, they always behaved as though they were being watched. And we can see that everywhere in our society today with security cameras all over the place, or this notion that like all of our digital activity is not really private and could be tracked or monitored, and in fact is always by companies who want to advertise to us, and probably the government and maybe Russian hackers or whatever. But this really blew my mind. One of my professors in grad school told me that the reason that the partitions in public bathrooms don't go down to the floor or up to the ceiling is also the panopticon. Because if we have total privacy, we could do whatever we want, which we don't, as a society, we're afraid of. So this idea that even though we're in this private place doing something private, there's always the possibility of being monitored. I thought that was really crazy. And this book too was really big for me, Theater of Operations by Joe Masco, which talked about the way the civilian population in the United States has been militarized and kind of trained since the Cold War to think kind of in these defensive terms. And it got really ramped up after 9/11. This might be familiar to you guys. This was the kind of terrorist level of threat alert system that they put in place after that. But it puts the onus of kind of vigilance onto the individual citizen in a way that then demands us to be more paranoid and pay more attention to each other and more suspicious of each other. I also think it's interesting that, it's hard to read, but the lowest level is green and the terrorist risk threat is still just low. There's never zero. There's no indication for no threat, only low. And these houses started to feel like that too. They started to feel like these kind of like panopticon houses where I couldn't tell if somebody was like looking out the window at me while I was taking a picture. But they also seem to be kind of both, the guard tower and the prisoner, because even though they are kind of surveilling their environment, they're also being watched by all the other houses. So there's this kind of like push and pull, and it felt like they were both watching but also trying to blend in. And around this time, I was also doing a project with this militia in Illinois, and so I was thinking a lot about camouflage and blending in and how all that works too. And I started feeling like the houses were trying to camouflage themselves also, or kind of blend into their own environment, which is kind of funny because they are the environment, right? It's like a suburban house trying to blend into the suburbs, but it's producing the suburbs by existing. So it starts to become this like weird self-fulfilling prophecy, referencing itself, but also something else totally. Oh, here's a meme about symbology. So I'll explain this to talk about the architecture I was seeing, but basically, first at the top you have this idea that like a sign represents what it looks like, right? You see a picture of a fish and you know you can identify that's not a fish, that's a picture, but I think of a fish. The second one, it's removed from a visual representation of a fish, but we know that came from the thing that we're thinking of as a fish in the first one. And then things get kind of weird. And the sign is like a weird kind of interpretation that actually has very little to do with the original image. And then at the bottom, the sign bears no relation to the original reality whatsoever. And it's its own pure simulacrum. So in this case, we have Swedish fish flavored Oreos, which I hope they don't actually exist, but I think they do. But these houses started to feel like that, like they were so removed from anything that made sense. And these rock windows I started to see, which is a pretty common decoration choice in the Midwest. But it's so far away from anything that it might be referencing. Like it's a window, but it's not a window. It's decorative, but it's ugly. Like all of these things that just seem to be kind of like Oh, that's funny. It lines up perfectly. There's a filled-in rock window there too. But they also started to seem like kind of like celebrating this opacity that the houses were so hell-bent on not letting you see in or participate with them in any way. This kind of like decorative inaccessibility that was interesting. So my response to that was to start cutting holes in the pictures I was taking to try to open them back up and make space again where they had closed it off. So I started doing it on Photoshop, just kind of seeing how it worked, and then I moved into a physical space and started cutting actual holes in things in different ways and trying to figure out ways to make more space in the pictures that were so like flat and closed off. So at that point I also started introducing vinyl siding to try to figure out what role it could play in all of this, because it felt like a very important material, for the kind of like symbology reasons, where like vinyl siding is designed to look like traditional wood, but we all know it's not, and at this point it's come so far away from that it's its own material, and like we identify it as such. We're not like, oh, that looks like it could be a wood house. Like there's no pretense of that. It's its own world at this point. But I didn't quite know what to do with it. I knew that I liked the way it kind of could obscure things and hide things behind it, but like in the same way that it does with a house. I like that kind of function, but I hadn't quite figured it out. So fast forward a little bit we'll just fast forward through the pandemic, and I got this residency. I moved to Utah, and now I live like kind of suburban mom lifestyle, where I just like go to Michael's and get groceries and stuff. But the landscape is very different here. Obviously, it's very mountainous, where the Midwest is flat, developed in a very different way. The environmental concerns, it's all different. But yet there's still this kind of like suburban lifestyle. And when I came out here, I immediately felt kind of connected to this photography movement from the 70s called New Topographics, which this is a Robert Adams photo. But at that time, there was a lot of new development out in these western cities like Colorado and here and places like that. And these photographers were kind of focusing on this strange ways that like mankind was altering the landscape. I got here pretty late for that party, but I felt like I was kind of watching towards the end of the story that they were picking up at earlier on. Definitely not the beginning, but earlier on in that kind of arc. And the development that I'm seeing here is just crazy. Like there's so much building happening and there's so much going up. And back in the 70s, when the New Topographics folks were doing it, it was easy to make it seem kind of strange because it was new, and now it's so expected. Like we almost expect this out of the landscape. We don't have any kind of notions that it could be anything else, but more of this. So my task is a little bit, I feel, to make it feel strange again, that comfort that we're choosing, that's so at odds with the landscape and the environment that's already here. But the comfort is really real. The comfort of the suburban lifestyle, like everything is so available. It's annoying if we have to drive more than 15 minutes to get to a Target, right? Like you could buy an iPhone at 100 different places in the valley, but any one of them will sell you the same iPhone. And so there's something kind of like very secure in that notion that like you could always go get the same thing at any of these places. You could always get a cheeseburger at McDonald's and it will taste the same. But with that convenience comes rules. And because everything is more and more privatized, even when we're in public, we're actually most of the time on private property. So like you're in the parking lot of the grocery store, you're at the gas station, you're at the mall, like those are all privately owned places, and so they can make their own rules. And and nobody really wants to get sued or robbed or anything, so they take extra precautions. So this is a sign in a parking lot of a thrift store, actually, which is kind of sad to me, but this idea that the no overnight parking sign is delineating this space as off limits to people who might need to use it for something other than spending money. And so these kinds of rules became really apparent to me here. And there's like a funny inversion that happens with public and private now, because like the residential neighborhood in the background is maybe more of actually technically a public space than the public space in the foreground, because it's a parking lot that's owned by the restaurant or whatever it was. So there's this kind of funny thing that happens where even though your kind of right to be in the neighborhood might be more tenuous depending on who you know or what you look like or whether somebody thinks you belong there, whereas nobody would probably question if you're in the foreground. You're just somebody in the parking lot of a business, even though actually those things are kind of reversed. And it seems like there's this kind of obsession with dividing and delineating and protecting space here. And I got really curious about that, like this really intense, all of the fences around everything, kind of holding everything in and keeping you from seeing anything. And I wanted to learn more about the culture that produced this world out here in Salt Lake. So I started going to museums. The first place I went was the Daughters of the Pioneer Museum, because that pioneer narrative is really dominant here. And the first thing you see when you walk in is this slogan over the door, "Our heritage, our responsibility," which really struck me immediately, because first of all, there's a we in that hour, like the hour makes a we, and so immediately you're defined either as part of us or not part of us. You're either an us or a them, like right off the bat. And it's also telling us that our heritage is our responsibility, which is a kind of way of saying, like, we have to control our own narrative, because if we don't control the narrative, it could be kind of imposed on us by someone else who might think differently than us. Inside the museum, there's lots of photos of dead Mormons and the things that made their lives up, their objects, their clothing, their furniture, their crafts. It really does feel kind of like a heritage cache or something from 200 years ago, 150 years ago. This is one of my favorite parts of the museum. In the basement, there's this giant black eagle guarding a bunch of sewing machines and empty bottles. But that's the original eagle that was on top of the Eagle Gate on State Street, which I think is also kind of cool. That thing is, I hate that gate though, it looks so bad. But what I was looking for was more this kind of thing, like representations of early settler life. This is a painting of Salt Lake, which is kind of crazy to imagine that it ever looked like that. But that's what drew people here, actually, in a lot of ways. There's also things like this, which were appealing to me because it started to talk to that delineation of space that I was looking for. And barbed wire is interesting because it's a fence, but it's defining space with the threat of violence. And I think that's maybe the first time like they got an object to do that, because it's not just a fence, it's a fence that will hurt you if you try to interact with it, or hurt a cow, more likely. But I thought it was interesting that they had a whole case of these, and actually this one's claiming to be the first barbed wire ever invented, which is dubious. I looked into it, and I think the first patent was filed in 1960 or 1865, but it's at least an early one. There's also this painting, which I thought was interesting. It's the painting of Utah's first state penitentiary. And I thought it was interesting that this was something that someone chose to paint as like a kind of celebration, and this kind of early in the history of Salt Lake, and so it almost feels like this is something legitimizing, like we're a society, like we can incarcerate people. And now it's in the museum kind of celebrating the way this place got developed. I also found a lot of pictures like this of like military troops. This is the Mormon battalion encampment from 1896. I guess I want to make everything into 1900s. But it's also reminded me that even though like the Mormons who came out here and established this place as Salt Lake City, they were a religious group, but they were also very, very ready to do violence also, and they did when they deemed necessary, and sometimes that meant slaughtering groups of other settlers passing through, which happened. I also went to the Capitol because I heard there were murals there, and it's also kind of a seat of state power, which I think is always an interesting place to kind of look for narrative forming clues. And I wasn't disappointed. This is one of the murals over the House of Representatives, these kind of romantic scenes of the caravans heading west. This is on the other side. There's always a guy with a gun. And that was interesting to me. Like it's all about this movement and the building and the new life and new opportunity, but there's always a guy with a gun making sure everything's okay. Here's Brigham Young entering the valley, and I thought this was interesting because it's so mythologizing. Like this is like literally myth making in process, right? He's here, he's making this religious hand gesture, he's got this epic stance. This is how we're like supposed to think of this happening. Even though probably when they got to the valley, they were all dirty and tired and exhausted. And they probably went back up there to pose for the painting or something. But again, he's got his guy with a gun there too, so you better not disagree. Here's another kind of fateful one. The caption on the top says, "Peace with the Indians, September 1852." And I thought this one was interesting because all the Native Americans are in these kind of passive stances, and then the two white guys behind Brigham Young are very intently watching. They look very suspicious, and again, guy with a gun making sure that nothing goes in a way that they're not planning for. So yeah, there's like always this kind of like threat of violence, even with the kind of, even in a peace talk, right? I kept going to museums. This one's in California, the Autry Museum of the American West in California. Another painting that kind of with a cross on the mountain in the background, like this idea of manifest destiny, right? Like this place is a gift to the white man from God or something. And I tried to take pictures of these paintings in kind of an irreverent way that wasn't trying to be accurate to how they looked or to fairly represent them, but to kind of highlight the fallible qualities of a painting, right? Like the texture and the frame, and that they're hanging on a wall, and that they have glare. So I was into the idea that the glare was kind of taking away the identity of the cowboy. And this painting is also interesting because it's painted by this guy, Frederick Remington, and this is the little card about it. And it says, "As they stumble through the desert in a vain search for water, the emaciated horse and his bedraggled rider evoke the disappearing Old West." This idea was the central focus of his work. And in 1908, he wrote, "I sometimes feel like I'm trying to do the impossible in my pictures, as there are no such people as I paint." So even at this point in 1908, he's romanticizing a time that he's imagining. He's like the original Make America Great Again. Like, it was better before, if only like we could go back to the real old days. And so like he's kind of outright admitting that he's mythologizing a time that he actually hardly was there for. So I went back to the studio with all this stuff, and I was trying to figure out, I had to do this show, and I was like, oh, I gotta make some art, I guess. So I was just trying to figure out how all this stuff was going together, making collages, kind of doubling down on that barrier idea that I started to investigate with that exclusion exercise piece of like putting fences behind fences behind fences. So no matter how many fences you get through or over or what, like there's always, you can never get inside these kind of like stacks of barriers. And these are kind of a mix of photos from here and the Midwest, but mostly I was using photos from here at this point. And then I started photoshopping things because I wanted to bring the paintings in and put those two kinds of images together and kind of compress the then and the now somehow. And so I was just trying different things, but Photoshop wasn't really working for me. I wanted them to be physical, so I went back to physical again and started using paper and cutting it and kind of literally interweaving these images to try to get that sense of that's how this started and this is how it's going. And the slicing and cutting also felt like my own kind of form of violence against the idea of like a tidy, clean history where everybody's happy, or a tidy, clean suburban world that doesn't have a bunch of hidden costs. So the cutting became kind of like me fighting back a little bit in a way in my own mind. And I also liked how the images started to fall apart, like literally and physically. Like it gets harder to see what they are, but they also start to kind of deteriorate. And then the trick became how to scale them up. So I made these little models to try to figure out how they were going to work. Here's another one. And yeah, I brought the vinyl siding back in, kind of thinking about obscuring and revealing the violence that had been done to the original landscape, the original inhabitants, and how like this whole place kind of exists on those terms. So I started choosing more violent images that I found to kind of bring that part home a little bit more. But they're still romantic, right? They're still kind of decorative and there's this sense of an idealized past, even though what these guys are doing is something kind of horrible. But that's kind of what the mythology of this place is all about, really, is like romanticizing the violence that produced it, because if you don't romanticize it, then it just gets ugly. So here's one piece that's right behind me, actually. Yeah, if you don't romanticize it, then you're just left with a really ugly story. This is the image that's behind this vinyl siding in this piece, which is really hard to see. But it's a massacre painting from after the Battle of San Jacinto in Texas. When the battle ended, the Texas soldiers decided to just slaughter all the rest of the troops, even though they had already won. And so weirdly, there's this painting kind of celebrating that massacre, and I thought that was really striking. And I wanted to share that with you. And that's what I got. If you don't look directly, yeah, there's something funny about the siding and its blandness hiding that image, because it's both protecting us from the violence, but it's also protecting the violence from really being scrutinized, right? Like if you don't see it, you can't think about it, and if you can't think about it, you can't understand it. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now culturally, where like we need to be able to look directly at these things in order to understand them, because if we don't, we'll just wind up repeating what's already happened. And I'll leave you with that thought. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thanks so much for being here.